trial of Adolf Eichman in Jerusalem is virtually over. But even so, if such a trial were taking place in England, it would be quite impossible for us to discuss it. The matter would be sub judice, and we'd be hauled up for contempt of court. But for months now, people all over the world have been discussing this case, and most of them have taken it for granted that Eichman was guilty. Now, faced with this problem, the Israeli Ministry of Justice decided that the usual rules really couldn't be applied in this case. In addition, Israel does not have the jury system, and the three judges are professionals and unlikely to be influenced by anything that happens outside their court. So we're not committing contempt tonight, and we're not perverting justice. We're simply trying to discuss something that is very important. Now, first tonight, we have Dr. Heinrich Gruber. He is the Protestant Dean of St. Mary's Cathedral in Berlin. He recently gave evidence in Jerusalem at this trial. And before the war, as a pastor, he got up a group of people who helped to smuggle Jews out of Germany. And he did so at that time with the connivance of the Nazis. The man he dealt with was Adolf Eichmann. Now, Doctor, what were your impressions of Eichmann at that time?
Ich habe 30 bis 40 Mal im Interesse meiner jüdischen Freunde mit Eichmann verhandelt.
I went to Eichmann 30 or 40 times to plead for my Jewish friends.
War immer kalt, gefühllos und von seiner Bedeutung überzeugt.
He was always cold, lacking in feeling, and convinced of his own importance.
Nur einmal schien eine menschliche Regung zu haben.
Only once did he show a spark of humanity.
Als ich eines Abends übermüdet in sein Büro kam, da fragte mich, warum kümmern Sie sich für die Juden?
When I came one evening into his office, very tired, he said to me, why do you do this for the Jews?
Sie werden doch keinen Dank ernten.
They won't thank you for it.
Ich erzählte ihm Geschichte vom barmherzigen Samariter.
So I told him the story of the Good Samaritan.
Und sagte, der einzige Herr, auf den ich höre, sagt, gehe du hin und tue desgleichen.
I said to him, the only master I obey says to me, go and do thou likewise.
Now, Doctor, I understand that in 1940 you yourself were thrown into a concentration camp. How were you treated?
Ich spreche nicht gern über meine eigenen Leiden.
I dislike speaking of my own suffering.
Aber gern über die meiner jüdischen Freunde.
But gladly of that of my Jewish friends.
Man hat mir die Zähne eingeschlagen.
They smashed in my teeth.
Aber ein blutendes Herz ist schlimmer als blutende Lippen.
But a bleeding heart is much worse than bleeding lips.
Das Leid meiner jüdischen Freunde war härter und bitterer.
The suffering of my Jewish friends was more terrible, much harder.
Es war schlimmer als die Hölle von Dantes Inferno.
It was worse than the hell of Dante's Inferno.
Wenn etwas weggekommen war, ein Becher oder ein Spaten, musste ein Bericht gemacht werden von Wachmannschaften.
If something was lost, a spade or a mug, then the guards had to put in a report.
Wenn ein Mensch umgekommen war, dann bedeutete das gar nichts.
But if a man was murdered, it had no meaning at all.
I see. Now, why do you think that the German people allowed these atrocities to occur?
Sie müssen verstehen, dass ich nicht gerne über die Schuld meines Volkes im Ausland spreche.
You must understand that when I'm abroad, I dislike to speak of the guilt of my own people.
In Deutschland selbst sage ich immer wieder, wenn mehr verantwortliche Menschen damals Zivilcourage gehabt hätten, wäre manches anders gekommen.
When I'm in Germany, I always say, had more men had the courage to disobey, then much would have been different.
Aber außerdem muss ich sagen, wenn in der ganzen Welt die Verantwortung für Flüchtlinge und Vertriebene gewesen wären wie heute,
but I must at the same time say, had there been the same concern for refugees throughout the world as there is today,
dann wäre vielleicht der Eichmann-Prozess nicht möglich gewesen.
Then perhaps the Eichmann case need never have taken place.
Aber da er nun einmal stattgefunden hat,
but as it has taken place,
so hoffe ich, dass er nicht nur der Menschheit, sondern auch der Menschlichkeit dient.
I hope that it will not only serve men, but that it will serve true humanity.
Und dass er uns aufs Neue unsere Verantwortung für Israel und das jüdische Volk aufzeigt.
And that it will point out anew to us our responsibility towards Israel and towards the Jewish people.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Now, to discuss the fate of this man Eichmann and his significance, we have three people in the studio. We have an international lawyer, we have a rabbi who is the principal of a Jewish public school called Carmel College, and we have a consultant psychiatrist. Now, Mr. Fawcett, perhaps we could begin with you. I think there's a legal point which sticks in many people's throat about this Eichman case. The man was kidnapped in Argentina and dragged quite unwillingly to stand trial in Israel. Does this cast a doubt in any way on the legality of this trial?
No, he was kidnapped, and his kidnapping was unlawful. Argentina complained about this to the United Nations. Israel went there to answer the charges. The whole matter was debated and settled to the satisfaction of the parties, and there's no outstanding complaint there. There is, I think, a general rule, certainly in this country, the United States and other countries, that no matter how a prisoner comes into the custody of the court, that does not affect the court's right to try him. Indeed, if it were otherwise, you would come near saying a criminal can only be tried by his consent. And there is some evidence that Eichman did sign a letter of consent. Whether he did or not, I think, is irrelevant.
Now, there's another point, too, which is, I think, also very difficult. Eichmann's alleged crimes happened at a time when Israel did not exist. They were committed against people who were not citizens of Israel, and they were committed on territory that never became part of Israel. Now, has Israel, therefore, a legal right to try this little man?
Yes, I think so. Of course, the general rule is that no country may try and punish a foreigner who has committed an offense abroad. That's the general rule, but there are really a number of exceptions. And I think if we just look at English law, for example, we can find some exceptions straight away. Take the Joyce case. Joyce was a US citizen who committed an offense in Germany. Now, I can't go into that trial now, but the fact is we tried and hanged him. Now, if you go into another field, take exchange control. A United Kingdom resident under the Exchange Control Act can commit offenses against the act abroad, whether he's an Englishman or not, and he can still be punished. Now, coming a little nearer to the point, we have another English statute on the statute book, the Geneva Conventions Act 1957, which adopts the principle that anyone, British or foreign, who commits any offense under the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949 relating to the treatment of prisoners of war and civilians in time of war and so on, whether he commits it in England or abroad, can be punished in the English courts. And this, of course, is a long development since the First World War of war crimes, or they've come to be called crimes against humanity. Now, these are to some extent legal technicalities, but the broad principle is that these sort of crimes are becoming matters of international concern, and this is a new idea. Sharpeville, Angola, Tibet are all matters of international concern, although they happen within the jurisdiction of a particular state.
Now, there is another point which doesn't really quite come out of that, but Eichmann's whole defense really is based on the idea that he was simply a junior officer obeying orders. Now, is that a valid defense in any way at all?
It's not a valid defense to at least some of the charges that have been brought against him. The old rule, I think, in English law has always been that superior orders were a good defense if they were lawful. And there are old decisions in the 19th century in England on that point, and I think Israel would probably follow them. But this new notion of war crimes, which developed after the First World War, has caused a certain change of attitude. And the British military manual now follows this principle, that the commission of a war crime does not enable the doer to plead the orders of a superior officer. It may be a mitigation of punishment. I think this is an important point, perhaps, in this trial, but it is not a defense if it is in itself unlawful and known to be unlawful by the man who has done it.
I see. Now, there is another point, too. I've been traveling a bit lately, and in America and in South Africa, and of course in London, too. I found that many Jews are curiously disturbed and unhappy about this trial. Now, Rabbi, do you think that Israel has the moral right to try this man Eichman? Is he not in danger in somehow participating in his own sort of crimes?
Well, there are people who doubt the wisdom, perhaps, of the trial, who are not convinced that it will do much good. but for myself, I'm completely persuaded that Israel has the moral right, I would even say the moral duty, to try Eichmann. I want to elaborate on this. You see, people have the tendency to regard what happened in Germany as some freak occurrence, an abnormal happening, as if it had taken place in a historical vacuum. In truth, this is not so. What happened was the ghastly culmination of a problem that had been allowed to fester for centuries. Wherever there is racial prejudice, whether anti-Semitism or any other form of racial prejudice, you have a virus in the system. And you can never be certain that in certain unpredictable circumstances, this virus, which you consider to be normal in ordinary routine circumstances, might not become a dangerous, fatal epidemic. Now, this is what happened. So although the climax, the bestial climax, came at a time of war, the root of the problem lies in our ordinary lives. Now, Dr. Gruber spoke a few moments ago, and I, as a rabbi, would like publicly to pay a very humble tribute to this truly noble Christian pastor. When he spoke in Jerusalem, he said that there was another man in Berlin who had helped Jews to escape from the concentration camps, had saved them from death. But he would not mention the name of this man because, in his own words, this man was still living in Berlin and he did not want to expose him or his family to suffering. Now, this is ghastly. This means that there are still certain circles in Germany, perhaps limited circles, that have learnt nothing from this ghastly tragedy of the massacre of 6 million human beings.
But what about this idea which many Jews have, that the one effect of this trial will be to increase anti-Semitism?
I doubt it. You can't cause anti-Semitism by this trial. You can only stimulate it where it already exists. I don't think one can take into account the reactions of the pathological anti-Semite.
Well, do you think that's true, Doctor? Do you think there's a danger of this bringing out latent emotions?
Well, of course, I agree entirely with the Rabbi. I mean, that this is not just a problem of anti-Semitism as such. This is the whole problem of having enemies and scapegoats, which we all tend to do to some extent. And where anti-Semitism is a particular problem, where there is a minority community of Jews, varies from country to country, but it's not in essential a different problem from anti-Negro feeling, and we have both to some extent in this country. This whole problem of condemning in other people what we can't stand in ourselves is really the basic psychological mechanism at the back of this. There are various other things which are known about it. For instance, it is known that anti-Semitism tends to occur in people who are rigid, authoritarian kind of people. It's possible, though I wouldn't swear to this at all, that the German tradition of authoritarianism made the problem worse in Germany, because if you're brought up in a very authoritative way, you tend to react by taking it out on anybody who is below you or whom you have been taught to feel inferior to you. But of course it's really a worldwide problem, and it's a problem which is just as much in us here and now as it was in Nazi Germany.
Well, your people, Rabbi, have been subject to this prejudice and persecution more than anybody else. I suppose the history of the Jews is perhaps the most appalling history of any people in the whole world. I would expect you to have a pretty human reaction to this trial. Would you, in fact, like to see Eichmann strung up at the end of it?
Without any reservation, no. Definitely no. I think that if Eichmann were executed at the end of this trial, it would lower the whole stature and meaning of the trial. It would assume that accounts have been settled. There can't be a settlement of such a ghastly tragedy by executing one man. And in any case, the real problem is not Eichmann. Had it not been a man called Adolf Eichmann, there would have been thousands of others. The real issue is to understand and conquer the forces that produced Eichmann and made this possible.
Well, wouldn't his condign punishment, his hanging, serve some useful purpose, perhaps as a warning, Doctor?
I shouldn't have thought the slightest purpose, no. I think that what we ought seriously to consider is the moral problems inherent in mass destruction, the wish to destroy one's enemies, and the fact that, for instance, how different is this really from dropping a hydrogen bomb, which we contemplate not with equanimity one hopes, but certainly the Americans and the Russians are talking in terms of dropping bombs on each other, of destroying hundreds of thousands of people, and of leaving after effects which are perhaps even more terrible than those of the concentration camps. Is this morally really different?
It would be certainly unlawful, and I think that if people were put on trial for this, they might be put in the same box of trying to find a defense like Eichman, superior orders.
In fact, the real difference is how close you are to people. Eichmann is more intolerable to us because he saw this happen. He maybe took part in it himself close to a person. If you drop a bomb from a height on 100,000 people, they are like insects. They are no longer human to you.
Right.
And I think
it's all impersonal and remote.
Yes.
Whereas signing the death certificates and repeating this day after day is
And I think
completely
the trial
inhuman.
helps to show us our responsibility for these weapons.
But, Doctor, there's one point that you've raised which I think goes to the heart of the matter, and I want to take it up. If you say that all this race prejudice of any kind arises out of the fact that we can't live with our own bestial natures and therefore have to project guilt onto someone else, this implies, doesn't it, that the real problem is not our relationship with our fellow man, but our relationship with ourselves.
Yes, but isn't this ultimately the same thing? I mean, what one wants to avoid is a relationship where you condemn any other human being as being not human any longer. If you can treat him as a person like yourself, then you don't do these things to him. If you can identify with him in some way or another, it's only when he becomes something no longer human that you do this.
Yes, but this is where we might differ. I speak as a rabbi, as a teacher of religion.
Yes.
Although what I'm going to say is not an argument that derives its strength from any one organized religion. I don't believe that man comes to terms with himself and with his fellow man unless he recognizes the brotherhood of man, and this brotherhood of man stems only from the relationship of the fatherhood of God. Let me just elaborate. People are very fond of quoting the statement, love thy neighbor as thyself.
Yes.
It often comes as a surprise to many people to know that it's to be found in the Old Testament, in Leviticus. Now, this phrase, love thy neighbor as thyself, is really only half the sentence. The whole sentence is, love thy neighbor as thyself, for I am the Lord thy God. Now, if we will not recognize that we all have one Father, why should we assume that we are all brothers?
Well, just a minute, Rabbi. I think if I understand you rightly, you're suggesting that religion is in some way a means of preventing the expression of this sort of prejudice. That certainly hasn't been true in history. I would have thought religion has produced some of the worst persecution and prejudice.
I would not say that religion has. You might as well say that the phrase liberty, what crimes have been committed in thy name, is a condemnation of liberty. Certainly those who have regarded themselves as being the representatives of the organized religion, the only organized religion with a sole monopoly of truth.
Mine, in fact.
No, I'm not sure. Don't ask me to defend it, though I might. They, I think, have abused religion. But I'm speaking now of man's relationship with God, not an organized church. And I think that man only finds peace within himself and a healthy relationship with his fellow man through this means, the fatherhood and then the brotherhood.
Well, I don't think I'd agree with this. I think that it's quite possible for people to find peace within themselves and with their fellow men through attaining to a really mature, adult kind of relationship with their fellow men, even without a necessary belief in a transcendental being.
Well, I don't think those two ideas sort of cut each other out in any way. But I'd like to turn to another point, a rather practical point. What purpose has this trial really served, quite apart from being an act of justice or political demonstration on the part of the Prime Minister of Israel? What purpose has it served for us? Would you say it had any legal purpose?
Yes, I think it's helped to generalize the notion of a crime against humanity, which is all part of this development of the notion of brotherhood. 100 years ago, a father could beat his child, insensible, nobody could do anything, nobody cared. Now we care. Internationally, we're trying to do the same.
Has this added anything to what was already achieved at Nuremberg, with the trials of the major war criminals?
No, because this is a trial by a national court. I think you have to distinguish the Nuremberg trial, which is an international tribunal. It's rather distinct.
In your sphere of work, Rabbi, would you say that this trial had added anything new?
Definitely. And there are three issues in which I think this trial has been a source of strength. The first, had this trial taken place in any country where Eichman had committed his atrocities, what kind of trial would he have had? In a so-called, a very quick one, in one of these people's courts. Now, here is a state that has come into being, a Jewish sovereign state, the first in 2,000 years, after centuries and centuries of persecution. The people there largely are the remnants of persecuted European Jewry. They are putting on trial a man who symbolizes all their persecutors. And they do so openly, in the full glare of international publicity, and you, I think, have experienced the trial and will bear witness to the fact that it has been solemn, just, and dignified. Now, this I find to be healthy. I think it's very healthy. The second point, I think it was in June that the Roman Catholic Church in West Germany proclaimed June the 18th as a day of prayer for the victims of Nazi persecution and also a day of prayer for the persecutors. But they added something more. They said that on this day, the members of the church, 21 million in fact, should engage in visible acts of atonement. Now, visible acts of atonement. This I find quite wonderful and heartening. I don't know of any organized church that's called for visible acts of atonement of 21 million. And finally, this is the point that concerns us. Someone once said that anti-Semitism, in fact all racial prejudice, is a pornographic subject. Everyone knows it exists, but nobody wants to mention it in polite society. 25 or 30 years ago, we couldn't have had this conversation. We would both have been inhibited. Somehow this Eichmann trial has made the abscess burst, and you as a Christian and I as a Jew can now talk to one another.
I think that's quite true. Now, Doctor, I'll give you the last word. Do you think that the trial has done anything to improve, say, the mental health of the world in international aspects?
Oh, I don't know that one can say that, but I do think that one must face the fact that people tend to forget and they tend to turn away from the unpleasant facts in human nature. The more we can be aware that such things can go on, that they can happen, that people can behave in this atrocious way to each other, the more likely are we to be able to control it. It's only through consciousness that we can control ourselves.
Thank you. Now, when I left the Eichmann trial, like a surprising number of other people, I left with an unexpected feeling of guilt inside me. We are all inheritors, I suppose, of a Western and of a Christian tradition. And Eichmann, too, is a part of that tradition. And I believe that we share in a considerable measure in that man's guilt. I believe that the trial was necessary and good. But I also have a terrible feeling that such things could happen again in many other places, though perhaps in different degrees. And that's why I think this trial is so vitally important. Good night.